2347, July 26, 1942. Western Desert, Egypt. Roughly 30 kilometers south of the coast road, near Sidi Haneish. Captain David Stirling, age 26, crouched beside the lead jeep and checked his watch under a scrap of blacked-out cloth. The luminous hands pointed to 2347. In 13 minutes, if everything held together, engines, guns, nerves, 18 jeeps of the Special Air Service would drive straight onto a German airfield and attack the Luftwaffe at point-blank range. He straightened, brushing sand from his knees. Around him, the line of jeeps sat nose to tail in the darkness, engines idling at a low, uneven rumble. Each vehicle was a stripped-down Willis or Ford jeep, barely 1.25 tons of metal, canvas, and fuel. The windscreens were removed. The bonnets were bare. Every flat surface bristled with jerrycans and ammunition boxes. Most important of all were the guns. Each jeep carried pairs of Vickers K machine guns on a central pedestal mount, some with twin pairs side by side. The Vickers K, an air-cooled .303 caliber gun originally designed for aircraft, could fire up to 950 rounds per minute. The SAS men called them K-guns. At full rate of fire, a single jeep could spit out several thousand rounds in seconds. Tonight, 18 jeeps would drive in line abreast, all guns firing, into a parked forest of German aircraft. At 2349, a tall figure moved down the line, checking positions. Major Blair Paddy Mayne, age 27, unofficial enforcer of the unit and Stirling's most aggressive subordinate, stopped at each jeep, leaned in close, and repeated the same message in a flat voice. Stay in formation. Fire only forward. Don't stop unless you have to. Most of the men were in their early 20s. Corporals and troopers from Britain, New Zealand, and elsewhere in the Commonwealth. Many had already survived parachute disasters, failed raids, and long drives across the desert with the Long-Range Desert Group. A few were new, on their first mission. Every man had a Thompson or Lee Enfield within reach, but tonight, the main weapon was the jeep. At 2352, Stirling walked to the front of the column. He could just make out the pale strip of the moon overhead. It was a full moon night, bright enough to cast hard shadows on the sand. Normally, the SAS moved only on dark nights. Darkness hid their approach to enemy airfields, which they attacked on foot with Lewis bombs, small incendiary charges designed to burn aircraft to the ground. But in June 1942, things had changed. 4 weeks earlier, on June 21st, Tobruk had fallen. Rommel's Afrika Korps had smashed through British defenses and driven east. By early July, German and Italian forces were pressing towards El Alamein, barely 100 kilometers from Alexandria. The British Eighth Army was hanging on to a narrow defensive line between the Mediterranean and the Qattara Depression. Any serious German breakthrough could open the road to the Nile Delta. The Luftwaffe's role was critical. German and Italian bombers hit British supply columns, ammunition dumps, and rear area ports. Transport aircraft flew vital fuel and parts forward to desert airfields. If the Eighth Army wanted to survive, it had to keep those aircraft grounded or destroyed. Since late 1941, Stirling's small, improvised unit, formerly L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, had specialized in doing exactly that. Their method was simple. Get behind enemy lines. Reach an airfield. Sneak in at night. Plant Lewis bombs on as many aircraft as possible. Disappear before dawn. But by mid-1942, the front was moving fast. German patrols were more aggressive. The desert was more dangerous. Stirling needed a new way to hit more targets, faster, and escape before the enemy could react. The answer was in front of him now, jeeps modified into mobile gun platforms. Instead of planting bombs in silence, the SAS would drive directly onto the airfields and shred parked aircraft with machine gun fire at close range. It was louder, riskier, but much faster. At 2358, Stirling walked back to the nearest jeep, climbed into the passenger seat, and pulled on his goggles. His driver, a corporal from the Scots Guards, gripped the wheel and stared into the darkness ahead. Behind them, in the rear of the jeep, the gunner checked the twin Vickers K again, Feeling the cool metal of the charging handles, the drum magazines locked in place. Each jeep carried thousands of rounds of .303 ammunition. Ammunition boxes were stacked on the floor, wedged between fuel cans and spare parts. On top of that were Lewis bombs and thermite grenades, for any aircraft that survived the first pass. Stirling raised his arm. Midnight, July 27, 1942. He chopped his arm down. 18 jeeps rolled forward as one, engines revving. They formed into two lines, then into a wide line abreast as they picked up speed. The desert track smoothed out. The moonlit horizon opened in front of them. Somewhere ahead, beyond the rippling sand and low ridges, lay Sidi Haneish airfield, the designated target. Intelligence suggested dozens of German aircraft were parked there. Ju-52 transports, Ju-88 bombers, perhaps fighters. If they caught them on the ground, concentrated on a few long strips of hard-packed sand, the damage could be decisive. At 0:07, the column reached its last planned halt before the run-in. The jeeps slowed, then stopped briefly. Men checked their weapons one last time. Goggles were pulled tight. Scarves went up over mouths. Stirling stepped down, scanned the sky, and then the horizon. The moon gave the desert a flat, metallic sheen. To the north, they could just make out the faint, regular lines of the airfield, runways, dispersal areas, and hangars. No searchlights. No flares. No movement. He felt the familiar pressure in his chest. A mix of fear and calculation. If the Germans reacted fast, they could bring down anti-aircraft guns or even tanks. 18 unarmored jeeps, each with a handful of men, would not last long under sustained fire. But if they moved fast enough, if they hit hard enough in the first minutes, the enemy might not react at all. Surprise was their only armor. At 0:11, he climbed back into the jeep and gave the signal to move. As they rolled forward again, the story of how these men had come to this point hung over them like the desert heat of the previous day. Back on July 1, 1942, as the first Battle of El Alamein opened, L Detachment had already established its reputation. Dozens of aircraft destroyed in earlier raids at places like Benghazi and Fuka. High Command had noticed. Stirling's unit had been formalized as the Special Air Service Regiment, with more men, more vehicles, and more tasks. But success brought expectations. Senior officers wanted results at scale. Aircraft destroyed not in ones and twos, but in scores. The jeep raids were the answer to that demand. In early July, mechanics and armorers in rear areas had worked around the clock. They removed anything non-essential from the jeeps, spare seats, superfluous body panels, even some lights. They welded pedestal mounts for the K-guns. They tested firing patterns, discovering that the recoil could twist the light vehicles off course if the gunner wasn't braced properly. The men adapted. They trained to fire in short bursts, to coordinate overlapping arcs of fire across the line of jeeps, to drive by compass bearing across open desert at night, using the moon for orientation. Now, at 0:18, all of that preparation was about to be tested in combat. The airfield grew larger in front of them. Shapes emerged, long, pale runways, darker rectangles of hangars and huts, small dots that, as they drew closer, resolved into aircraft. At 0:22, the leading jeeps crested a low rise. Below them, less than 1,000 meters away, lay Sidi Haneish airfield. Twin-engine aircraft sat in neat rows along the main strip. Trucks and fuel bozers clustered near the edge. No one was moving. Stirling lifted his hand again and signaled to spread. The jeeps fanned out into a wide attacking line, each one separated by roughly 20 meters. 18 vehicles, side by side, facing the airfield like an improvised armored brigade with no armor, only speed and firepower. At 0:24, with the moon high and bright, the SAS crossed the invisible boundary of the airfield perimeter. There was still no alarm. No searchlight. No tracer. Stirling leaned forward, eyes fixed on the nearest row of aircraft. "Fire!" he shouted. The first Vickers K opened up. The first Vickers K opened up. At 24 minutes and 37 seconds, A stream of .303 tracer slashed out from the right flank jeep and stitched across the nearest parked aircraft, a Junkers Ju-52 transport. The bullets tore into thin aluminum skin, fuel lines, and control surfaces. A fraction of a second later, 3 more jeeps joined in. The night exploded into light and noise. 18 engines roared. Dozens of machine guns hammered. The quiet desert airfield turned into a moving wall of fire. Stirling's jeep hit the hard-packed runway and bounced. The driver fought the wheel, keeping the vehicle in line as they accelerated to about 40 miles per hour. Ahead, at a distance of barely 200 meters, he saw the silhouette of a twin-engine bomber, likely a Ju-88, angled nose out from a dispersal bay. The rear gunner leaned into his twin Vickers K. He fired short, brutal bursts, 1 second, 2 seconds, then off. Each burst spat around 15 to 20 rounds per gun. 4 streams of metal slammed into the bomber's wing root and cockpit. At 24 minutes and 55 seconds, the bomber erupted in a dull orange flash as fuel or ammunition ignited. Flames licked up around the canopy. The heat washed over the jeep as they tore past, close enough for Stirling to see the German markings on the fuselage. To their left and right, other jeeps were doing the same. Each driver focused on keeping formation, front wheels tracking the line of the runway. Each gunner selected targets in his arc: transports, bombers, fuel bozers. They fired, adjusted aim, and fired again. For a few seconds, there was no organized response from the airfield. Ground crews had been asleep in huts or tents. Guards had grown used to the routine of the desert night. The idea that an enemy unit would drive straight onto the runway with headlights off and weapons blazing simply did not fit their expectations. At 25 minutes and 10 seconds, scattered German small arms fire began to answer. Individual rifles and machine guns barked from the edges of the field. Green and red tracers snapped past the jeeps, some low, some high. A bullet sang over Stirling's head and smacked into a fuel can behind him, spraying petrol onto the floorboards. He smelled it immediately. Sharp. Heavy. "Leave it!" he shouted over the gunfire. There was no time to stop or check for leaks. The plan depended on momentum. If one jeep halted, the line could collapse, and with it, the psychological shock that came from a synchronized charge. The SAS attack pattern was simple and brutal. On paper, the plan called for a straight drive down the central runway, with each jeep firing to its designated side. Once at the far end, they would wheel around, return on a parallel course, and hit any surviving aircraft. If resistance was too strong, they would break off and head south into the desert, using pre-planned escape routes. In training, they had practiced this at lower speed on improvised airfields, scratched into the sand. Distances were measured: 800 meters from threshold to first aircraft, another 1,000 meters through the parking area, then a few hundred meters to clear space for the turn. In reality, everything was compressed. At 25 minutes and 23 seconds, Paddy Mayne's jeep hammered past a cluster of Ju-52 transports parked almost wingtip to wingtip. The Ju-52, a trimotor transport with corrugated metal skin and a wingspan of nearly 30 meters, was a prime target. They were slow and rugged in the air, but on the ground they were helpless. Each aircraft could carry troops, fuel, or supplies critical to Rommel's frontline units. Mayne stood half upright in the passenger seat, braced against the windshield frame, his hands locked on the grips of the K-guns. He fired in controlled bursts at engine nacelles and fuel tanks, walking his tracers across one aircraft, then shifting to the next. The effect was immediate. Metal panels sparked and tore. Engines shattered. Canvas control surfaces shredded. Flames leapt from at least 2 of the transports as leaking fuel met tracer ignition. Behind Mayne, another jeep concentrated on a row of fuel bozers. They were soft-skinned tanker trucks, each holding several thousand liters of aviation gasoline. A few seconds of concentrated fire into the tanks produced the result the SAS wanted. At 25 minutes and 41 seconds, one of the bozers went up. The explosion punched a rolling orange ball into the sky, briefly silhouetting the attacking jeeps and the wrecked aircraft around them. The shock wave hit the line like a physical shove. Shards of metal and burning fuel scattered across the runway. The explosion had two effects. On the one hand, it added chaos to the German response. Men ducked, flinched, and turned away from the blast. Orders were lost in the noise. Defensive positions that might have opened sustained fire on the jeeps were disrupted. On the other hand, it made the raiders more visible. The bright flame silhouetted them against the runway, turning them into clear targets. At 26 minutes and 5 seconds, the first sustained defensive fire cut in. From the north side of the field, a 20 mm flak cannon opened up. The German anti-aircraft piece, likely a Flak 30 or Flak 38, had a cyclic rate of around 220 rounds per minute and fired high-velocity shells capable of tearing through a jeep like paper. The crew swung the gun down from its usual anti-aircraft angles and raked the runway at low level. The first burst chewed into the ground between two jeeps in the center of the line, kicking up plumes of sand and debris. The next walked onto the rear vehicle on the left flank. At 26 minutes and 12 seconds, that jeep took 2 or 3 hits. One shell smashed the engine block. Another punched through the driver's compartment. The jeep slewed sideways, lost speed, and rolled to a halt, smoke pouring from the shattered bonnet. The gunner, still alive, swung his K-guns onto the source of the fire and squeezed the triggers. His tracers slashed back at the flak position, forcing the German crew to duck. For a few seconds, the heavy cannon fell silent. The rest of the line did not stop. They drove through, past their damaged comrade, following the core of the plan. Keep moving, keep firing, do not bunch up. Stirling saw the burning jeep on his left as they roared past. He felt the familiar conflict, instinct to help versus the cold calculation of command. Stopping to assist would expose his own jeep, and others, to concentrated fire. The men in the wrecked vehicle knew the risks. They had rehearsed this scenario. The mission came first. He forced himself to look away and focus on the next target. At 26 minutes and 30 seconds, the jeeps reached the far end of the main runway. They had been on the airfield for barely 2 minutes. In that time, they had destroyed or crippled dozens of aircraft. Fires burned in multiple places. Ammunition cooked off with sharp cracks. Black smoke began to drift across the strips. Now came the most dangerous moment, the turn. The plan called for a wide sweep at the far end, then a second run back down a parallel track, catching any surviving aircraft and confusing the enemy as to their direction of escape. In a cramped space, at high speed, under fire, this was not easy. The lead jeeps slowed slightly and began their turn to the right, swinging around the end of the runway like racing cars taking a tight corner. Tires bit into the sand. One jeep bounced over a shallow drainage ditch, tilted alarmingly, then slammed back onto all 4 wheels. At 26 minutes and 46 seconds, as they came around, 2 more German machine guns joined in from the southern edge of the field, firing diagonally. Their tracers slashed across the turning arc of the jeeps. A bullet cracked through the canvas seat beside Stirling and punched out through the floor. Another hit the metal frame of the Vickers K, sending a shower of sparks and fragments into the gunner's face. The man flinched, wiped blood from his cheek, and kept firing. The second run began. On the return pass, the SAS adjusted tactics. Instead of all jeeps firing solely to their outer sides, some shifted to engage specific threats: the flak positions, clusters of vehicles, groups of men trying to man additional guns. At 27 minutes and 3 seconds, Mayne spotted a machine gun team sprinting towards a sandbagged position. He pivoted the K-guns and cut a short burst across them. 2 figures dropped. The third dived behind a pile of crates and vanished. The jeeps drove through a landscape now transformed by their own attack. Wrecked aircraft burned or lay crumpled on their landing gear. One Ju-52 had broken in half, its tail twisted away from the fuselage. A Ju-88 sat nose down, its undercarriage collapsed, both engines on fire. Sporadic fire continued from isolated German positions. But the volume of organized resistance had dropped. The speed, shock, and sheer destructiveness of the initial charge had dislocated the airfield's defense. At 27 minutes and 30 seconds, with their second pass nearly complete, Stirling judged they had done enough. Ammunition levels were dropping. Fuel was being burned at a rapid rate. The longer they stayed, the greater the chance that nearby German units, armored cars, tanks, or more flak guns, could respond. He raised his arm, signaling the break-off. Each jeep, as it cleared the main concentration of aircraft, veered southward in turn. They threaded between burning wrecks and craters, bounced back onto open desert, and accelerated away from the airfield. Behind them, the fires merged into a single sprawling glow on the horizon. Secondary explosions still rippled through the night as fuel and ammunition stores detonated. At 28 minutes and 12 seconds, less than 4 minutes after crossing the perimeter, the SAS force was clear of Sidi Haneish airfield. Out in the dark, away from the intense light of the burning aircraft, the raiders regrouped. One by one, jeeps slotted back into formation, counted off by their commanders. Not all answered. They had lost vehicles. They had lost men. But in the calculus of war, the trade was brutal and simple. A handful of jeeps and troopers for several dozen aircraft and tens of thousands of liters of aviation fuel. In strategic terms, it was an extraordinary exchange ratio. At 0:31, Stirling ordered radio silence broken briefly to report success on their internal net. Short, coded phrases confirmed the main objective. The airfield was burning, aircraft destroyed, enemy response disrupted. Now the second phase of the operation began, the escape into the desert and the long, dangerous journey back to friendly lines. At 0:31, with Sidi Haneish burning behind them, the 18 jeeps, now fewer, dropped to a steady pace and pushed south into the open desert. The engines no longer screamed at full throttle. Instead, they settled into a hard, grinding rhythm around 25 to 30 miles per hour, optimal for fuel consumption and mechanical survival. Above them, the full moon still hung clear and bright, painting the sand in sharp silver and black. At 0:37, the first halt order went out by hand signal. The line compressed against a low ridge. One by one, the jeep swung into a rough chevron and stopped, engines idling. Men climbed out, stretched cramped legs, and began the count. Number 1. Here. Number 2. Here. By 0:40, the tally was complete. They had lost multiple jeeps on the airfield. One had taken 20mm hits and burned in place. Another had been disabled by small arms fire, its radiator punctured, its driver killed. A third had vanished in the confusion of the second run, last seen limping through smoke with one wheel at an awkward angle. But most of the raiders were accounted for. Some were wounded, shrapnel cuts, burns, bruised ribs from vicious jolts over craters. One man had a bullet groove across his scalp, hair matted with blood. Another clutched his left arm, where a fragment of metal had torn through muscle just above the elbow. At 0:42, Stirling walked the line in the faint moonlight, checking faces, wounds, and vehicles in turn. "How much fuel?" he asked each driver. The answers came back in gallons and guesses. Each jeep carried multiple jerrycans, 20-liter cans strapped to fenders, sides, and rear racks. Before the raid, they had been full. The approach and attack had already burned a portion. The escape would burn more. Roughly, they had enough to reach the rally point and, from there, to strike west towards Allied lines. But only if they maintained discipline. No unnecessary speed surges, no detours. At 0:47, he gathered his immediate commanders, Mayne and a handful of senior NCOs, around the bonnet of his jeep. He laid a map across the metal and weighted it with a spare magazine. Their position, estimated 10 to 12 kilometers south of Sidi Haneish. The pre-planned route, south-southwest to a rendezvous with elements of the long-range desert group, scheduled around 3:30. From there, a longer leg back towards the El Alamein line over the next 24 to 36 hours. Complication: the raid had been loud. Any nearby German unit with functioning vehicles would now be fully alerted. Columns of trucks or armored cars might already be moving to cut them off. Decision: maintain the plan. Trust speed, darkness, and the vastness of the desert. At 0:52, Stirling folded the map, gave final instructions, and signaled the column to move out again. Between 1 o'clock and 2:30, the world narrowed to sand, engine notes, and the faint glow of the burning airfield receding behind them. Navigation was by compass and star. Each jeep carried at least one prismatic compass, shock-mounted to minimize vibration error. The lead vehicles took bearings on Polaris and key constellations, adjusting for the slight drift introduced by wind and terrain. The drivers kept their wheels on the faint tracks of the jeep in front, guided also by occasional hand signals, arm up to slow, down to speed up, side to side to adjust formation. At 1:17, the wind picked up. A light northerly began to push fine sand across the surface in streamers. Not a full sandstorm, but enough to reduce contrast. The horizon softened. Features blurred. The jeeps adapted. Distances between vehicles shrank from roughly 20 meters to 10 or less. Drivers leaned forward over their wheels, eyes straining to keep the shape of the next jeep in sight. At 1:39, the column crossed a patch of broken terrain, low ridges and shallow hollows carved by old wadis. Speed dropped to avoid breaking springs or injuring already battered men. Each jeep suspension, never designed for this kind of punishment, groaned under the strain. In the third vehicle, a right rear leaf spring finally gave way with a sharp metallic crack. The jeep lurched, tilted, and struggled forward. At 1:42, they halted briefly to assess. Under the dim moonlight and with limited tools, there was only so much they could do. The damaged spring was lashed up with rope and whatever scrap metal they had to hand, enough to keep the jeep moving at reduced speed. Leaving it behind would save fuel and reduce risk. But it would also mean abandoning its crew in enemy-controlled desert. Stirling made the call in seconds. "We keep it. Drop it to the rear. Everyone watch your spacing." By 2:05, the glow of Sidi Haneish was gone behind them, replaced by total darkness. The adrenaline of the attack drained, leaving only fatigue and the slow ache of muscles locked in tension. In the back of one jeep, a gunner slumped forward, his hand still wrapped around the grips of his Vickers K. The corporal beside him nudged his shoulder. "Hey, stay with me. You can sleep when we hit the RV." The gunner nodded, forced his eyes open, and shifted his grip. The K-guns were now quiet, safeties on, barrels cooling in the night air. Each weapon had consumed hundreds of rounds in the attack. Some guns showed signs of overheating, discolored barrels, stiff actions. Armorers would have work to do if the unit survived to fight another day. At 2:27, they made their scheduled turn to the southwest, based on pre-raid navigation calculations. Stirling confirmed the bearing with a handheld compass, cross-checking against his map and the stars. Every small decision mattered. A 10-degree navigation error over tens of kilometers could mean missing the rendezvous entirely and blundering into enemy positions or deep into trackless desert. At 3:11, the forward jeep spotted a faint, prearranged signal on the horizon. 3 short, shielded flashes of light, repeated at 1-minute intervals from a low rise. The long-range desert group had arrived. The LRDG were desert specialists, New Zealanders, guardsmen, and others trained to navigate and survive in the Sahara for weeks at a time. Their trucks, Chevrolet or Ford 30 CWT vehicles stripped and modified, carried extra fuel, water, rations, and heavy weapons like Vickers medium machine guns and Boy's anti-tank rifles. At 3:17, the SAS column rolled into the RV area. Engines finally cut. Silence descended, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the murmur of voices. An LRDG officer stepped forward, clipboard in hand, and shook Stirling's hand. "Good to see you, David. We saw the fires." Stirling nodded. His goggles left pale circles of clean skin around his eyes. The rest of his face was striped with dust and sweat. "Plenty of aircraft gone," he said shortly. "We'll know the exact tally later. Right now, I need fuel, water, and space for wounded." By 3:30, the improvised support point was fully active. LRDG crews moved with practiced efficiency between jeeps. Jerrycans were drained and swapped. Water bottles refilled. Wounded men were lifted gently into trucks, where there was more room to lie flat. A quick medical assessment began. One man with severe burns was given morphine and bandaged with whatever clean dressings they had. Another with a suspected fractured rib was strapped tightly to minimize movement. At 3:48, with essentials handled, the commanders gathered again around a map, this time under the dim glow of a shielded lamp. They plotted a route west-northwest, avoiding known enemy patrol areas and minefields. The plan called for a long looping path across open desert and then back towards British lines near El Alamein, arriving sometime late on July 28th or early on the 29th, depending on conditions. The LRDG trucks, with their greater range and load capacity, would act as mobile support, carrying extra fuel for the jeeps and providing backup firepower if they ran into trouble. At 4:10, the combined column, SAS jeeps and LRDG trucks, moved out into the paling darkness. Dawn was still an hour away, but the eastern horizon had begun to show a faint, lighter band. Morning in the desert brought new dangers. At 5:27, just as gray light spread across the sand, air cover became a concern. German reconnaissance aircraft could be airborne by sunrise, scanning the desert for signs of unusual movement. A column of vehicles, however dusty and dispersed, was easier to spot in daylight. To mitigate this, the column adopted a looser formation. Distances grew between vehicles, up to 50 or 100 meters where terrain allowed. Drivers were instructed to follow broad bearings, not exact tracks. If spotted, they hoped the enemy would see scattered, ambiguous traces rather than a single cohesive force. By 6:03, the sun broke the horizon. Temperatures began to climb rapidly from the cool night values towards the brutal heat of a North African July day, often above 40 degrees Celsius by midday. Men loosened scarves, adjusted headgear, and smeared more sand and cloth over exposed metal where possible, both to reduce glare and to avoid burns from hot surfaces. At 7:22, the first aircraft sound rolled overhead. The column halted briefly. Men scanned the sky. A small, twin-engine machine, possibly a reconnaissance variant, passed high to the north, flying east to west. It did not deviate from its path. Either it hadn't seen them, or it had more important areas to check. They moved on. Over the next 24 hours, the raid on Sidi Haneish began to shift from immediate survival to historical fact. At 10:40, resting under hastily rigged tarps for shade, some of the raiders spoke quietly about what they had seen on the airfield. "Did you see that row of transports? Must have been 10, 12 at least. More. I counted 15 before the fuel bowser went up." Rough estimates from multiple witnesses suggested that around 30 to 40 aircraft had been destroyed or seriously damaged. Some were definitely Ju-52 transports, others heavier bombers. Fuel and maintenance facilities had also taken severe punishment. At 14:05, with the sun at its highest and the heat punishing, Stirling made a note in his small waterproof notebook. It was nothing elaborate, just time, location, and a brief operational summary. Objective: Sidi Haneish. Method: jeep assault. Result: heavy destruction of aircraft and fuel. Casualties: several jeeps lost, Kia and WIA to be confirmed. Overall, success. These notes would later form the backbone of formal after-action reports and, much later still, historical accounts of the raid. For now, they were just a commander's effort to capture details before time and fatigue blurred them. By the evening of July 27th, as the column drew closer to British-controlled territory, the strategic implications of the raid were becoming clearer to those who understood the balance of forces in the desert. For Rommel's Afrika Korps, every aircraft lost on the ground was one less machine to protect convoys, scout British positions, or bomb supply routes. For the Eighth Army, every aircraft destroyed by a handful of raiders in jeeps was worth many guns on the front line. For the men of the SAS, it was proof that their unorthodox methods, small teams, deep penetration, surprise, mobility, could deliver results out of all proportion to their numbers. At 21:30, as they halted for the night under another clear sky, Stirling knew that the raid on Sidi Haneish would not be their last operation. But it would become one of their defining actions. The question, as he lay on the cooling sand staring up at the stars, was how long they could keep playing this high-risk game before the desert, the enemy, or sheer bad luck caught up with them. On July 28, 1942, at 9:15, The first of the returning SAS jeeps rolled back into British-held territory near the El Alamein line. They did not arrive in parade order. The vehicles were scorched, dented, and dust-caked. Some were missing body panels. Others ran with makeshift repairs, springs lashed up with rope, bullet holes patched with scrap metal, leaking fuel lines wrapped in rags. But they were moving under their own power, and most of their crews were alive. At 9:23, Stirling climbed out of his jeep near an advanced headquarters tent cluster. His legs shook slightly when his boots first touched firm ground. He had been either in motion or in a state of readiness for nearly 36 hours. A staff officer, fresh uniform crisp against the desert backdrop, stepped forward. "Welcome back, Captain Stirling. Report says you made quite a mess of their airfield." Stirling nodded, wiped a smear of oil from his hand onto his trousers, and gave a simple answer. "Yes, sir. Sidi Haneish won't be much use to the Luftwaffe for a while." Formal debrief began at 11:05. In a hot, canvas-walled briefing tent, Stirling, Mayne, and a handful of senior NCOs sat at a rough wooden table facing a small group of intelligence and operations officers. Maps were laid out. Aerial photographs of Sidi Haneish taken before the raid were pinned to a board. The process was methodical. At 11:12, Stirling described the approach phase, routes, timings, navigation methods. At 11:26, he outlined the attack, entry point, formation, target priorities. At 11:39, Mayne stepped in to detail specific engagements, rows of Ju-52s, burning fuel bozers, estimated aircraft counts. Intelligence officers asked for numbers. How many aircraft destroyed? Conservative estimate. Stirling replied, 30 to 40, including multiple transports and at least several twin-engine bombers. Some partially damaged aircraft may be reparable, but a lot of what we saw was burning hard. At 11:52, they turned to casualty figures. 2 jeeps definitively lost with their crews killed or missing. Another jeep destroyed after the raiders evacuated wounded and set it on fire to prevent capture. Several men wounded to varying degrees. For a unit that measured itself in dozens of men, every loss was personal and deeply felt. But in terms of military arithmetic, the exchange was stark. By 1400 hours that day, preliminary reports from aerial reconnaissance began to filter in. Photographs taken at 12:30 showed blackened aircraft skeletons along the runways and dispersal points of Sidi Haneish. Fuel dumps were scorched patches. Several hangars showed collapsed roofs. One analyst laid the images side by side, before and after, and began marking crosses over destroyed aircraft. 37, he concluded at 15:18. Confirmed destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. Maybe more, but that's what we can see clearly. For the higher command of 8th Army, the raid's impact was both practical and psychological. On paper, 37 aircraft removed from the order of battle meant fewer sorties against the British front. Each Ju-52 lost represented a significant reduction in the enemy's ability to ferry fuel, ammunition, and key personnel forward from rear bases. In July 1942, with Rommel's supply situation already strained, such hits mattered. But the raid also sent a message. At 18:30 on July 29th, in a more formal setting, senior officers discussed the broader meaning. A small, lightly equipped force had mounted a deep penetration raid, hit a valuable target, and extracted itself with relatively limited loss. It confirmed that the Desert War was not only about artillery lines and tank battles. It was also about disrupting the enemy's logistics, mobility, and sense of security. Unofficially, among frontline troops, stories spread even faster than reports. Within a week, men in infantry battalions and armored regiments along the El Alamein line were talking about those madmen in jeeps who had driven straight onto a German airfield and shredded the Luftwaffe's machines at point-blank range. Details were distorted in the telling, but the core remained. Small teams, fast vehicles, and relentless aggression could hurt the enemy in ways heavy formations could not. The phrase, 18 madmen, began as a half-joking reference by a British officer who had seen the returning jeeps. It stuck in unit slang and, in time, in popular history. For Stirling personally, The raid on Sidi Haneish was both a validation and a warning. Validation, because it proved decisively that his concept for the SAS, small, highly trained units, deeply inserted, hitting high-value targets, could produce strategic results. The destruction at Sidi Haneish was the sort of outcome he had argued for since the unit's inception in late 1941. Warning, because the margin for error was thin. One or two things differently. Fog over the airfield, an early alarm, a more effective German flak deployment, and Sidi Haneish could have become a massacre of his men and a crippling setback for his still fragile regiment. In August and September 1942, the SAS continued operations across the North African theater. Jeep-borne raids on airfields and supply points became a recognized tool in the British arsenal. Tactics refined at Sidi Haneish, line-abreast runway assaults, rapid in-and-out timings, target prioritization, were adapted and reused. At 2100 hours on October 23, 1942, when the Second Battle of El Alamein began with a massive artillery barrage, the Eighth Army fought with at least some advantage in the air, helped in part by the cumulative impact of SAS raids like Sidi Haneish that had steadily bled the Axis air power. The war, however, did not slow down for one unit's success. On January 24, 1943, at roughly 8:30 near Gabes in Tunisia, David Stirling's personal war largely ended. While conducting another deep reconnaissance and raiding mission, he was captured by German forces after a series of close calls and chases that finally went against him. Within days, he was identified as a key figure behind the Special Forces operations the Germans had come to dread. Considered too dangerous to be left in a normal prisoner-of-war camp, he was eventually shipped to Colditz, the high-security fortress for persistent escapees and special captives. From that point, he was out of the field. Others would carry the SAS banner forward. One of them was Blair, Paddy Mayne. Mayne, already a legend within the unit for his ferocity, leadership, and willingness to take personal risks, grew even more central to SAS operations after Stirling's capture. Promoted and given command responsibilities, he led further raids across the Mediterranean and into occupied Europe. Sidi Haneish had hardened his sense of what was possible. Driving jeeps under moonlight into the heart of a Luftwaffe base and surviving had confirmed his belief in decisive, close-in aggression combined with careful planning. Between 1943 and 1945, Mayne and the SAS fought in Italy, France, and Germany. They shifted from desert operations to European terrain, sometimes trading jeeps and sand for parachutes, forests, and towns. But the core principles remained the same: hit hard, move fast, strike where the enemy felt safe. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, Mayne had become one of the most decorated British and Commonwealth soldiers of the war. He was awarded the DSO with 3 bars, among other honors. Many argued he had been denied the Victoria Cross by the narrowest of margins. After the war, both men carried their experiences into very different lives. Stirling, released from captivity, did not return to conventional military command. Instead, in the late 1940s and 1950s, he moved in business and political circles, eventually involving himself in security-related ventures and later controversial activities, including private military and political initiatives. He remained associated in the public mind with the founding of the SAS, a man who had seen a gap in doctrine and had pushed, against bureaucracy and skepticism, to fill it. Mayne returned to civilian life in Northern Ireland. A qualified solicitor before the war, he initially tried to resume a normal legal career. But the transition was not smooth. The intensity of wartime command, the loss of close comrades, and the abrupt shift from constant danger to peacetime routine weighed on him. He played rugby again for a time, a sport where he had already been prominent before the war, but never fully escaped the shadow of his combat years. On December 14, 1955, at the age of 40, Paddy Mayne died in a car accident in his hometown of Newtownards. Many who knew him believed the war had never really let him go. The SAS itself nearly disappeared in the immediate post-war drawdown. On October 1, 1945, the original wartime SAS regiment was formally disbanded. For a brief period, it seemed that the British Army's experiment with special raiding forces might end as an historical footnote. But the ideas forged on raids like Sidi Haneish were too powerful to ignore. By 1947 to 1950, elements of the SAS concept began to re-emerge in different forms. In 1952, the 21st SAS Regiment, Artists' Rifles, was raised in the Territorial Army, carrying forward the name and spirit of the original unit. Later, a permanent regular Army SAS regiment was established, eventually becoming a central part of Britain's modern Special Operations Forces. In training halls and briefing rooms in later decades, instructors referred back to North African operations. The principles drawn from Sidi Haneish and similar raids became standard doctrinal points: surprise over mass, mobility as protection, high-value targets over enemy body count, independent, highly trained small units over rigid formations. When Special Forces units in later conflicts, from the Cold War to the early 21st century, planned deep raids against airfields, communications hubs, or terrorist camps, they were, in part, echoing what 18 Jeeps had done under a full moon in July 1942. Today, the raid on Sidi Haneish sits in military history as one of the classic examples of what a small, determined force can achieve against a larger enemy through innovation, courage, and calculated risk. It did not, by itself, shatter Hitler's entire air power. The Luftwaffe was vast and fought on many fronts. But in North Africa, at a crucial phase of the Desert War, 37 destroyed aircraft and the shock to German confidence mattered. For the men who drove those jeeps, Stirling, Mayne, and their troopers, the operation was not an abstraction. It was the heat of burning fuel on their faces, the thump of 20mm shells into sand, the hammering of Vickers K guns under their hands, and the long, uncertain drive into darkness afterwards. Their legacy lives on not just in regimental badges and museum exhibits, but in the doctrine and mindset of modern special operations forces worldwide. Small units, big impact, and the belief that, under the right conditions, a handful of madmen in fast vehicles can change the course of a campaign.